Welcome to the Soul Grit Podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hi, welcome back to the Soul Grit Podcast. This is Ann, and I'm here today with my friend Chad Potts. Hi, Chad.
Hello. Good to see you again.
Now, Chad's a returning guest. I know we just had him on a few months ago, but that conversation was just so cool to me. Like, I just love talking to you about both the things things of the Lord and of our faith, but also just what can we do in our clinical professions to help people have better mental health. And so Chad is both a pastor and a pharmacist. And so he's got a really unique perspective. If you didn't hear that previous episode, you're going to want to go back and listen to that one too. On that episode, we talked more about medications for depression and anxiety, and even some like antipsychotics, different classes of medications that are commonly prescribed for people with mental health issues. But Chad and I both come at this perspective of like, this is a really great resource. This is a part of common grace. Science is something that God has given us to be able to heal. But it's not the only thing. Our faith is still important. Our lifestyle is important. And there's a lot of other things that we can do to be healthy. And so we're going to get into that conversation today. But today, because we didn't have time enough to talk in the last conversation about this, we're going to be focusing specifically on ADHD and the medications that might help with that, as well as other ways that we can try to alleviate some of the symptoms of ADHD. So you ready to jump in, Chad?
Let's do it. I'm excited.
Well, I don't know about you, Chad, but ADHD is very close and personal to my heart because I have a daughter who was diagnosed I think she was about 11. She's 14 and a half now. So the last few years, basically middle school and the beginning of high school, we've really been dealing with, okay, your brain doesn't work the same way as other people's, but your brain is beautiful and creative and so cool, but some things are harder.
Right. And that's a really good way to think about it. We're quick to label people, aren't we?
Yeah.
In our world today. And in my studies, one of the things I've come across, this wasn't related to pharmacy or any of this, but I came across Walt Whitman said it this way. He said, you can either be you can either be curious or be judgmental. So his quote was, be curious, not judgmental. And, we're very quick to label people. We're very quick to label things in our world today. Going back to our previous conversation, you're depressed, you're that anxious person. You're that ADD, ADHD person. And, we call you that as a label. But in reality, like, my brain goes to why. I've always been in my studies, in my pharmacy role, I train students, I train residents, and a lot of them started kind of calling me the why guy, because I'm always like, all right, but why? And I just always had this curiosity about myself. So what, your brain is beautiful. Your brain doesn't work like everyone else's, but I'm not going to label you and stick a sticker on you and say you're different or you're weird or there's something wrong with you. Let's dig into the why and let's see what makes things harder. And I've got family, loved ones. The middle child always seems to be the one that we have the most problems with, and that's the case in my world too. But the middle child, we've had his teachers kind of say, "Hey, you might want to get him checked out." And he's just 5.
He's only 5. Okay.
But he's apparently yeah. And we've done a lot of thinking and praying and delving into this lately too. Because we're noticing the same thing with him. We're like, well, his brain seems to work a little differently than the other two. And so we naturally go to why. And I love that. I love that you're so open-minded about some of this, and some of the ways that we can help come alongside people that are suffering with this because, yeah, things in life become harder as a result of this, but there are some ways we can come alongside them and help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, right before we hit record, we were talking about how every new thing you try to do, you have to learn like three different new kinds of technology. And
Yep.
it actually seems like that as a parent too, as a parent of a child with a neurodivergent brain, like there's a lot of things that you have to learn to be able to make the world work with your child, right?
Yep.
Like recently, I just discovered another AI tool that can help people with neurospicy brains to be able to chunk down tasks so that they're not so overwhelming and they don't get stuck
Yeah.
in just some of the executive functioning problems. So, like learning these things, it's not that your brain is broken, it's just that your brain is not set up for how the world is set up. And so we
Hmm.
have to use different supports and techniques to be able to get you to be able to accomplish the things that other people need to do to survive. So
The phrase that comes to mind is personalized healing.
there you
Um,
go.
Somebody probably came up with that before me, but
Oh
I'm
yeah.
going to coin it today. Uh, Personalized healing, because that's what it is, right? I mean, we're helping people find healing in their space
Mhm.
in a way that just we're not going to mass heal everyone the same way.
Mhm.
So if there's something that's going on that looks different, then we may need a different approach.
Mhm.
And it's that way with life in general, isn't it? If you've got multiple kids, and you can't do the same thing for all of them and expect the same outcomes.
Mhm.
They're all very unique and they're all very different. And so, yeah, I love that you have that mindset of how can we help you in a different way succeed, because the way that the world is structured may not be setting you up that way.
Mhm. Well, one of the issues that we were having, you may be familiar with the term masking, where like you're your own kind of weird, right? And but you do masking to be able to fit in with
Yeah.
your classmates or your coworkers or whatever. And what we were finding is that my daughter was so exhausted from masking all day
Mm.
that she would just fall apart every evening, every afternoon, evening, and not be
Wow.
able to finish the things that she needed to do. And so one of the solutions we came up with, and thanks to COVID for this, for opening different educational pathways, we were able to take her out of full-time high school, put her only 3 classes on campus, and then the rest online,
Cool.
which we have to do a lot of post-its and checklists and things to keep her on task with the things she has to do independently. But
Sure.
what it's done is brought back kind of like the sparkle to her eyes, the
Mm.
creativity, the joy. Like she's more of the kid we know she could be because she's not spending all day holding her weirdness inside.
She's not so overwhelmed. And so my oldest daughter's a little bit that way too. And the
Mhm.
way that I've kind of phrased it to my wife is she knows how to play the game. Like she plays the game all day at school.
Mhm.
She knows what it takes to succeed. She knows what it takes to get in good with the teachers, get in
Yep.
good with your teammates, fit in with your classmates, and all of these things. She knows what it takes, and she masks. That's exactly right. She masks that all day, and then she comes home and she's totally exhausted.
All apart.
She's melting down about every little thing, and it's not an everyday occurrence, but it's often.
Mhm.
And I look back to my childhood, and this isn't about me, but I look back to my childhood too, and I relate to that so much because we all have our unique personalities, and unfortunately, and this isn't a knock against the school system, it's just the way that it is. Anytime you have mass education, you put a lot of kids together, you're gonna, if you're different, you get made fun of.
Yeah.
If you're different, you're less than. And
Mhm.
so we spend a lot of time and energy and effort in trying to just blend in when we were
Yeah.
made to stand out, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's just part of the way we were created is for our personalities to shine. And so finding unique ways to do that. I love that you said she has that sparkle in her eye again.
Yeah.
Just being able to find those ways to where they don't have to hide it anymore.
Yeah.
It's okay to be you. And I think that's kind of the big message that I'm trying to send to my kids. And, the reason we're here together is that
Mhm.
we're teaching people it's okay to be you.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's really helped in our family is, and I wouldn't recommend that you just sit around with your kids watching Instagram reels all day, but there are some creators that are making YouTube or Instagram videos that are helping people feel like more relatable, right?
Mhm.
So we found a couple of creators that are really talking about what it's like to have ADHD and what
Mhm.
are the cool things about it and what are the things that make it really hard and you have to kind of just laugh at yourself because you're not going to do it like everybody else.
Sure.
And once we started finding those, my kids started feeling like the thing that they have are is kind of cool, actually.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
people like Penn Holderness, who wrote just last year wrote a book called ADHD is Awesome.
Mhm.
Like that was pretty cool. My daughter actually made a t-shirt and it's the Avengers logo because we're kind of like a Marvel family, you know. It's
Mhm.
the Avengers logo, but instead of Avengers it says ADHD and underneath it it says it's basically a superpower. And so she
I
wears
love
this
that.
t-shirt. Yeah. Because it
That's
is a
so cool.
superpower for certain things like
Yeah.
creativity
Mhm.
and problem solving, you know, but not all the other executive functioning things that we need to do from day to day.
Yeah. And it can play an important role in a lot of different areas, in cognitive areas, academic areas, social areas. It can be an impairment, but it's also a gift in a lot of other ways. And so, being able to see it as that way is that there's not something wrong with you because you have this diagnosis.
Mhm.
And that's the same with, I think, really any mental health issue. Seeing it that way, there's
Yeah.
not something wrong. I'm not defective
Yeah.
because I have ADHD, or
And you
ADD, or we
mentioned,
talked about the difference.
yeah, we're going to talk
We
about
lump them
that.
together, but
You mentioned too that we don't really want to label our kids or label ourselves. Like that's not helpful because God created us all unique and individual. But on the other hand, sometimes having a label is really helpful. One, because it helps you feel like, oh, there's a reason why things are hard for me, or
mhm,
there's a reason why I feel weird. The other is that it helps you get the resources that you need. So if you never got an ADHD diagnosis, you would never know that there are stimulant medications that might help you,
mhm.
right?
Yeah,
So,
100%. Yeah, there's power in naming something.
mhm,
Um, there's
mhm.
power in having a name for it. Too often with our labeling though comes these feelings of judgment and shame,
Yeah.
and this issue that I'm not good enough. And so I think we have to be careful to come on the other side of that and say, all right, this is what it's called,
Mhm.
but here's what that means, and being able to shape that in a positive way.
Yeah. So since we're kind of talking about it, let's get down into the nitty gritty about the name.
Sure.
So ADHD is a attention hyperactive, uh, hyperactivity, right?
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
That's the ACE
Attention
part. Yeah,
deficit.
there's
Yeah.
ADD, attention deficit disorder, and then ADHD, attention deficit with hyperactivity disorder.
Right. And there's like a slash in there, right?
Yep.
And so what happened, a little bit of history about this, a previous, we get all our diagnoses from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and there's been, several editions. I think we're on the 5 right now.
hmm
And so um, we take our titles from that and our labels from that, and it gives us all the diagnostic criteria for how we know if somebody has that thing, because there's no
Right.
blood test for most of
hmm
the mental health things. So we're just using a set of criteria. So in the 90s, when you and I were growing up, we
hmm
had people who had ADD, attention deficit disorder, and then there were other kids who had ADHD because they
Yep.
were hyperactive. And for the most part, there were boys with ADHD and
Yep.
there were girls with ADD
That's kind
because
of how it differentiated itself, wasn't it?
yeah,
So.
the attention deficit, meaning like you're spacey, you're
hmm
daydreaming, you can't stay on task, you're unfocused, all of that. That ended up showing up a lot in girls. Girls didn't
hmm
have the hyperactivity as much. And so when you kind of think about this like quintessential ADHD kid, you're thinking about a third grade boy, right? That's
right.
just like running around the classroom and calling out when he's not supposed to, right?
Yep.
But there
Or my middle kid.
your middle or Chad's middle kid, that's for
Right.
sure.
he's the
Right?
he's the poster child, but yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stereotypes that go into that. And so then we said, well, maybe we give that kid Ritalin or something like that, and then that will make them calm down.
hmm
And then there's all the problems. We're going to get into that in a minute.
hmm
But what tends to happen is a lot of girls with these symptoms of inattention tend to just fly under the radar because,
Yep.
like you said, like with your daughter, She knows how to play the game of school. So
Yeah.
she can look like she's not breaking the rules. She's not drawing attention to herself. And so the
Mhm.
teachers think, what a great kid.
Right.
But the problem is she has no idea anything the teacher said. She can't track in social situations because all her friends were having a conversation and then she comes up with some random statement that has nothing to do with what they were talking about at the moment.
Yep.
And now they all think she's weird.
Yep.
So there's a lot of social isolation that happens, which is pretty traumatic to little girls.
Can be. Yep.
So, yeah. So for some reason, I don't really know the reasons behind this. When they made the DSM-5, they decided it's not two separate disorders, ADD and ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be ADHD, but then we have to have these
Slash.
subclassification.
Yeah.
So we have to say ADHD, primarily hyperactive type or
Mm-hmm.
inattentive type or combined
Yep.
type. So there's
Yep.
basically those three. You can have both at once.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, and it's largely I think probably because we treat it mostly the same. Um, a lot of your treatment is gonna focus on the same underlying mechanisms in the brain, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's almost a little more complex than it used to be. But I think it's with good intentions because you're right. There were so many people that were flying under the radar, especially these young girls,
mhm,
and they may not be getting the things that they need from class, from academic,
mhm.
institutions, from social settings and that sort of thing. But then we just think, oh, they're quiet, or oh, they're
Yeah.
shy, and
Yeah.
they're the model student, and we just keep passing them right along, and we think nothing's wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of there is this awareness of sorts I think we need to have to realize that it doesn't have to present itself in the way that we tend to think about the poster child, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The little boy that there are the couple of different things. There's inattention, which is what we talked about, the inability to be able to focus.
Mhm.
Um, and we live in a world of multitasking.
Yeah.
I'm kind of the belief that multitasking is a myth.
Yeah. Yeah.
We think we're multitasking, but what we're really doing is we're doing a couple different things halfway,
Yeah.
at least in my experience. But, inattention is a big deal in really all the world we live in.
Mhm.
And if you've ever, there's some of that I think to be expected with children. They have
Mhm.
to learn how
Yeah.
to focus. They have to learn how to, okay, when when daddy uses this voice, that means listen, because what my little boy tells me, he says, Daddy, you're using your serious voice.
Oh.
And, he said, why are you using your serious voice? Because I need you to really listen to this, because, they tend to tune out after a
Mhm.
while. And, some of that's normal for childhood. But, is it excessive for where there should be developmentally? That's really where you have to start asking these questions.
Mhm.
Then there's impulsivity, which kind of is on the heels of that hyperactivity part.
Mhm.
Do they act impulsively? Is there this need to constantly fidget? Which we all have some of those. Again, like you. The funny thing is, when we were learning mental health disorders in pharmacy school, I was pretty sure I had all of them.
Yeah.
Whenever, whenever we
Med
finished with that
students
course,
disease.
yeah, right. I'm like, I can relate to every single one. So you'll find that you have traits of these things,
Yes.
but it may not be excessive for the developmental stage that you're in. And it may not be, and another thing too is it impairing your function? Is it impairing your ability to function and thrive in activities and social settings and that kind of thing? But, like, for example, I find myself always moving.
Mhm.
It drives my wife crazy. We'll be laying in bed and my foot will just be going. She's like, would you just please quit? Um, you know, we, we all have some, I think a lot of us have fidgeting things, but is it excessive? Is it impairing the ability to learn?
Mhm.
Is it impairing the ability of others to learn? Because in a mass education system like the public school system, that's a big deal too.
Or
Um,
even later in life, like you said, if your foot's always moving in bed and your wife wants to go to sleep, like
right. Yeah.
that's causing a disruption in your relationship because at
It
some point
is.
he's gonna be just that irritated with you.
Right. And most of the time it's funny. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Depends on how much sleep we've gotten lately. But, and there's this, do they sit down when they're told? Do they have trouble staying seated?
Mhm.
Um, Again, I think there's some level of normal there. Most children, especially boys, are not just going to sit at the table and sit there all day.
Yeah.
And nor do I think we're really forcing them to that extent. But are they excessively talking? Are they blurting out in class inappropriately? Now, I will say a lot of times, and this is there's a lot of controversy around this today. It seems like ADD, ADHD, diagnoses, and is it legitimate, or are we just over medicating our children? You do have to go through proper avenues, right? There is DSM-5 criteria that they must meet, and it's pretty strict criteria. Like, it's not like, is your child hyper? Yeah, okay, well then they have ADHD. There you have to have like over 6 of these categories. I can't remember exactly, but and then over 6 of another category, and I mean it's pretty, it's pretty complex. It's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
But is there maybe a push towards, in a mass education system, if somebody's being disruptive, to maybe get them looked at? Maybe so. Because here's one thing that I've noticed in a lot of children around me, and a lot of interactions I have with other men and other families, is that it seems like a lot of kids may be bored. Maybe they're even gifted, and their minds are ahead of what the teacher's talking about, and so therefore they have some of these same issues. They have trouble sitting down. They're fidgeting. They're blurting out answers because they know it all. Like, don't know it all, but they know, they're a step ahead. And so I think we really have to, use the proper channels that we have. Like, use your pediatrician that knows your child. Be able to ask questions like, okay, well, in the context of school, is this different than the context of home? Because one of the actual definitions is that it has to happen in 2 or more environments.
Right.
It can't just happen at school. It has to be school and home. And so, if they're just acting this way at school, but they're not acting this way at home, then that might make you think, okay, well, maybe they're bored. Like, what are some? Yeah, right. And so, there are other considerations, because you'll find that as you listen through this, or at least I do, I'm like, pretty sure all my kids have this. Without looking at the DSM-5 criteria. It's just, they all have traits.
Yeah.
Because I think there's just normal expectations of children.
Yeah.
They don't know how to control themselves sometimes. And some of that's to be expected. But one thing that I like to talk about too is that there's also an issue of not treating when they really do have an issue.
Right.
Particularly, we've mentioned some of the issues that may come up down the road. So the social skills, that can lead to things like depression, anxiety, even suicide. They're ostracized because everybody thinks they're weird because their brain thinks differently. But even what we have found is that if we don't address the impulsivity, that's one of the things that really seems to play itself out later in life, because what that can result in is, as a teenager and as a young adult, it can manifest itself as substance use disorder. It can manifest itself as risky sexual behavior, or it can even, they're looking for this thrill. They're impulsive. They're doing whatever it takes to feel good in the moment.
Driving or spending
Exactly. So, there is an issue on both sides of that. We don't want to over prescribe, because we'll talk about in a minute. No medication is without adverse effects. You're going to have side effects from most anything. If you ever see the commercials, which I'm not a big fan of, but anyway.
Death.
yeah, right. It's always concluded by may cause death, and I'm like, okay, well, you're going to die anyway. So, but yeah, that's not comforting. But keeping in mind there are side effects to every medication. But then we don't want to just ignore this either. We don't want to sweep it under the rug. We don't want to not treat it if it is an issue.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to highlight that there's harm both ways. So really using those resources, your pediatricians that know your children, they're going to really help you kind of navigate this world.
Yeah. And the school system as well. They're there. I mean, they may push back on you and not want to assess your child, but you have a right to that under public education. And
they see kids every day. Like they're going to be really your first. One of the things we've asked the teacher with our children, especially the middle one, is, okay, we see this too. Is this abnormal compared to his peers?
Yeah,
because we don't see other
boys, right?
Yeah. And that's really, they're really that first sign of maybe red flags, that something's up.
Yeah, that's good. So let's get into a little bit about what kind of medications are available and how do they work in your brain?
Yeah, sure. Mostly, the medications that are used are stimulants. And what they do, so it's kind of like this whole fight or flight system. So you've heard of that.
Mhm.
Worked out really well, when we were fighting saber-toothed tigers. We want our fight or flight system to be activated because we want to be able to, and basically what that means is that chemicals in the brain are released, such as epinephrine, norepinephrine,
Mhm.
and sometimes dopamine, depending on the situation. They're released and they help us focus on what do I need to do to get away from the saber-toothed tiger. You don't want to be scatterbrained, spacey, all this stuff. Oh, okay, there's a tiger. Oh well. You want to be able to focus on the task at hand. And it does a lot of other things in the body. It increases your heart rate. It increases your blood pressure. But it does help with focus. Well, what we have found is that, all right, we have some medications called stimulants,
Mhm.
and they stimulate that fight or flight response, and so it kind of mimics the whole "there's a saber-toothed tiger in a room,"
Mhm.
and it helps us focus. It may be an oversimplistic way of thinking about it, but what they do is they increase the amount of norepinephrine and epinephrine in the body. Epinephrine is another word for adrenaline, so you might have heard that before. When we're in an environment where we're in danger, we have adrenaline going through our body. Um, that's what we're talking about. And so these stimulants mimic that, um, but it's at a controlled dose.
Mhm.
So it's enough to hopefully help us be able to focus. It really hits on that inattentive spot.
Mhm.
And it can also help with some of those hyperactivity situations
Mhm.
because it allows us a singular focus to where we're not everywhere and
Yeah.
then bouncing around the room.
Mhm.
There's a long history of use of stimulants.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things I want to just say. I mean, stimulants get a bad rep. It'll cause your blood pressure to go up and your heart rate, and it can.
Mhm.
Those are some side effects we have to watch for and be
Mhm.
concerned about. But the idea is finding one that works best for you or your child, because adults can have this too.
Mhm.
And so finding one that's not going to raise the blood pressure, and it's not all that significant, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
We're talking like 3 to 5 points. So if you were 120, now you're 123,
It's not
125.
into a dangerous zone. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to just cause you to have a massive stroke. And they've looked at long-term studies, and there's no real long-term harmful effects of stimulants. There's not really been any direct tie from use of stimulants to cardiovascular effects. So
Mhm.
that gives us um, a little bit of hope in the treatment of this because in to the layperson, stimulating that fight or flight system all day or at least during the workday,
Right.
that doesn't seem like the best of idea. But science has it's created a dose that's effective for focus, but not going to harm everything else.
Yeah.
And so there
Now,
there are those potential for side effects, but it's not as prevalent as one might think.
one thing that I have observed though, when somebody has comorbid ADHD and anxiety,
Hmm.
then this can cause a problem,
It
right?
can.
So
Yep.
if you're already anxious and then but you're struggling with ADHD symptoms and you try to take a stimulant,
Yeah.
then just even though you're saying it's safe and it's just this little bit of bump, right? It's enough to push an anxious person over the edge.
Yeah.
And so sometimes if I see somebody that has both of those, we have to decide, is it more advantageous to you to treat the ADHD or the
Right.
anxiety? Because one is going to exacerbate the other. The treatment
Yeah.
for one is going to make the other one worse.
That's exactly right. And so if you're naturally a nervous person, then overstimulating that fight or flight is
Mhm.
going to cause you to you know sometimes even have like a
Panic.
panic attack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so, it's not for everybody. You really do have to kind of watch some of those other comorbidities. If someone does have unstable blood pressure, or if someone has, if it's an older person and they have some sort of heart defect or heart issue, you want to be careful with that.
Yeah.
You may want to try some of the non-stimulants, which we can talk about too. But what we know is that the stimulants work best. The
Okay.
stimulants work well.
And
The
can you
stimulants
just
work
say some
fast.
of the names? Yeah. Can
Yeah.
you say some of the names of them so we know what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so things like Ritalin, Focalin, Adderall. Some of them come in a patch, like a Daytrana patch. Those are some of the things we're talking about. So, on your prescription bottle, it may say some big long word, methylphenidate, dimethylphenidate, dextroamphetamines, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Those are the chemical names, the generic names. But yeah, you're talking Ritalin, Adderall, that sort of thing.
Okay. And then
Yeah.
what are some of the non-stimulant
Yeah.
options for pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, sure. So non-stimulants, there's a couple of options. One's really new, and one's been on the market for a little while. Before I talk about those, though, let me give you a caveat about some of these stimulants too, because
Okay.
you're kind of looking into, all right, when would I use a non-stimulant? And so, yeah, so you're looking at the patients who adding a stimulant, so a comorbidity of anxiety, uncontrolled blood hypertension, uncontrolled high blood pressure, that sort of thing, heart issues. Also, if someone has had intolerable side effects to the stimulants,
Yeah.
one of the things, and you probably noticed, one of the things about stimulants is they tend to decrease appetite.
Mhm.
They because think about it, when you're fight or flight, you got this tiger chasing you, you're not real interested in eating.
Mhm.
That that's your body's way of prioritizing is basically what that is,
Yeah.
and it's not going to prioritize digestion or eating or anything like that. It's basically prioritizing survival.
Right.
And so you're not going to be hungry. It's going to stimulate your appetite. So for some people who are generally like underweight, they can really kind of fall off the charts, off the growth chart, specifically children.
Children. Yeah.
They can fall off the growth trajectory, kind of fall into that 5 to 10% range, and that can be detrimental. So at that point, that might be a reason to switch over to a non-stimulant.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I'd mentioned about fight or flight. So one thing you don't want to do when you're in fight or flight is sleep, right? You want to ward off the tiger. You don't want to go to sleep. So it can cause insomnia in some patients.
Mhm.
And that can be a big deal especially for kids.
Yeah.
It can be a big deal for everybody. I've got 3 kids, and I'm convinced that like I'm just now sleeping.
Well, yeah, if your kid is awake all night, then you're awake all night. So you
That's
don't want
right.
it's bad
Yeah.
for the family.
And it's bad for mood. Things are a much bigger deal. My wife and I joke like, "Are you tired?" Because everything seems to be a really big deal to you. And we just know that about each other sometimes. But yeah, sleep's a big deal. And then there's also these stimulants are also controlled substances. So in the pharmacy, they're kept in the vault with the narcotics
Mhm.
because they are controlled substances. What that means is it doesn't mean they're dangerous. It doesn't mean, but it means that you can develop tolerance to it.
Mhm.
All right. So what that means is if 5 milligram does the trick today, just making up a number, then eventually I'm going to build up tolerance to that. Now I'm going to need 10 milligrams to do the same thing that 5 milligrams used to do.
Yeah.
And then over time, I'm going to need 20 milligrams to do. But the problem with that is as you increase the dose, you increase the risk of side effects.
Right.
Right. So, um, we're losing that little bit of selectivity sometimes of it helps me focus, but it doesn't affect the rest of my body.
Mm.
So those are maybe some reasons why we might want to start thinking, all right, maybe stimulants aren't the best because that's kind of our go-to first line.
Yep.
We know it works. It has this well studied, got long-term trials. But there's some new agents, and what these things do is really cool. I love science. I love the field of pharmacology because it's really problem solving. So it's like, all right, stimulants. All right, they increase focus, they increase norepinephrine, but they increase norepinephrine everywhere in the body.
Mm.
Right. So where we need it is in our brains. We
Mhm.
need it in our brains to help us focus, but it also increases norepinephrine in the body, which causes heart rate, palpitations, increased blood pressure, some of those things. So what these drugs, and you might have heard of the brand name Strattera.
Mhm.
The generic name is atomoxetine. Kind of works like an antidepressant. It increases the norepinephrine levels, but it only does it in the brain. It
Mm.
doesn't do it everywhere else. So you can see why that would be an advantage.
Yeah.
You're kind of pinpointing where you want that norepinephrine to go. But here's the problem. The clinical trials that have kind of said, all right, which one works better? Almost every single time a stimulant outperforms Strattera.
Mhm.
Um, it's not that it doesn't have a role; it's just not as effective, for everybody. And so,
Yeah.
that said, it may be effective for you.
Okay.
Everybody's made differently, and if so, man, hey, that's great because it's increasing the norepinephrine where it needs to be increased. And for some of these patients especially with cardiovascular issues, that's a big deal. And they can still have control of their ADHD, ADD,
Mhm.
but not have that increased risk of cardiovascular events. So it's all about the pros and cons
Yeah.
of each of them. And your physician can kind of help you weigh some of that out. Your pharmacist can help you with that too. But that's the reason I love pharmacology because it's problem solving. Like, all right,
Yeah.
we have this, it works, but how can we make it better? And they're all the time coming out with this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Another one is called Qelbree. It's Quelbree. Yeah, probably seen commercials for it, but it works basically the same way.
Okay.
But they're limited in their efficacy. They don't work as well as stimulants for everybody.
Hmm.
Generally, stimulants will work first try like 70 to 80% of the time,
Yeah.
which is pretty incredible when it comes to medications.
Right.
But those are your non-stimulant medications. There's also things that are called alpha blockers, so alpha adrenergic agonist.
Hmm.
Clonidine is one of those.
Okay.
Guanfacine is one of those. Those are old drugs, sometimes used for blood pressure, but they found that sometimes they can have a role in ADD, ADHD. The mechanism's not as highly understood. Some of the evidence is anecdotal, so it's not as tried and true as the rest of it. But there are options, I guess, is the message I'm wanting to put
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah.
Just because you can't take a stimulant doesn't mean you can't gain control of that disorder. So
Yeah. Okay, so let me shoot this at you and see if you can help me problem solve it.
yeah,
So when we
sure.
tried at 11 years old, we tried stimulants, and immediately, because these are drugs where you don't have to build it up in your system like you do with
Oh yeah,
antidepressants. You know it
right.
immediately that you've taken it. So
And that's one of the
immediately,
disadvantages of that's one of the disadvantages of the non-stimulants is because it's not going to work immediately like the stimulant,
okay,
the Strattera, the Qelbree.
build
They're
it
going
up.
to work 4 to 6 weeks. So
Ooh, yeah, that's a long time to wait. But
yeah,
uh, but when I gave my daughter a stimulant, immediately mood swings and like crying and like the world was over kind of. And
yeah.
I hadn't heard that like clinically before. Like, why does that happen? Where like she would just immediately start crying and be curled up on the couch.
Yeah, it just kind of flips people
Yeah.
into it's an instability of sorts. It's
Yeah.
like too much at one time.
Yeah.
It's almost like an overload of sorts.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've heard of that happening before, and there's a lot of considerations with some of the stimulants too. There's the dose. Largely, we like to start low and go slow. Tends to be our motto.
Mhm.
There's also like how long do you want that to last? Because they're short acting,
Yeah.
which can wear off in 4 hours or so. So if your child really has issues like right after lunch, you can time that you time that well. There's long acting, which lasts 8 to 12 hours. It just
Yeah.
depends on if you want if you need that through homework and that kind of thing. Every child's different. There's also like, do you want to have to administer it at school? Like that's a
Yeah.
consideration. Some of them you have to take 3 times a day.
Mhm.
Can they swallow pills? That's something that I don't think a lot of times we think about when it comes to children, but I mean that's a limiting thing. If they can't swallow pills, we got to do something different. No, a lot of these come in liquid. Um, you get into insurance copays and that sort of thing. Some of them come in patches. I've mentioned to you, so obviously cost and expense is a big part of that as well. But yeah, there's a lot of considerations, and then and then there's the whole. All right, if it's causing them to eat less,
Mhm.
if it's suppressing their appetite. You can also give some of those medicines I talked to earlier, clonidine, guanfacine. Those are kind of like they kind of offset
Okay.
some
Balance
of
it out.
those, and you can kind of use those to help too. So the sky's the limit sometimes when it comes to some of these things. But yeah, there's just so many different factors. It's not always a all right. We took this medicine and it's a magic pill.
Yeah.
Everything's so much better. It's a lot of trial and error. We talked about that last time. I think it's a
Mhm.
lot of trial and error, but don't give up. There's probably something you can tolerate, and there's probably something you can deal with.
Yeah. Well, that experience of having those like really dramatic mood swings
Yeah,
made it so that my daughter does not want to try any medications ever
yeah,
again.
yeah,
And
yeah. I'm
so
sure.
that made us have to look at, okay, well, how can we manage this without a
That's good.
prescription?
Yeah,
So some of the things we have looked into is different supplements that can help. So my daughter takes magnesium glycinate every evening, and that seemed
good.
to have an impact,
Yep,
helping her balance her blood sugar. So eating more protein and fewer refined carbs has helped.
yep,
Having a little bit of caffeine because it does have a stimulant effect, that has
yep.
helped as well. So what else can you tell us, non-pharmaceutical, that might help
Yeah,
in this area?
and I love this, and that may sound weird coming from a pharmacist, but I
Mhm.
love non-pharmacological treatment. That's my happy place because largely, if you ask me, you know, my podcast, the RevRx podcast, my tagline is, in a world where there's a pill for everything, um, we tend to just overprescribe. It's not that medications don't have a role,
Yeah.
but a lot of times we tend to overuse medications, and we tend to sometimes look for the easy button
Yeah.
instead of doing some of the hard things first. Not necessarily talking about mental health per se, but particularly things like diabetes,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Weight loss.
some of your metabolic issues, obesity. Yeah, we want that easy button. But anyway, side tangent.
Yeah.
But when it comes to this, there's really, I mean, it's very similar for a lot of disease states. So you mentioned number one, food, right? Caffeine can be helpful. Tea can be helpful. It gives you that little bit of a stimulant because those are stimulants, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you that little bit, and that can really help people maintain under control for a large part of the day.
Yeah.
Finding that balance there. I love what you're doing with controlling blood sugars because that's so important. You may think on the surface, what in the world does blood sugar have to do with ADD, ADHD? A lot. What does blood sugar have to do with most of the body? A lot.
Yeah.
Uncontrolled glucose is not healthy for any organ system, including the brain, including the central nervous system. So, yeah, looking at things like increasing protein, decreasing ultra processed foods, that alone can really make a difference. Because here's some things that we've seen over the years, and some of this has not really lent itself out. Has not really played itself out in some of the clinical trials, but it's been postulated that there's a cause versus correlation question. So is this a correlation we see, or is this a direct cause of ADHD? Things like food dyes, particularly some of those red food dyes. Things like processed sugar. I can't tell you how many times it seems like we send kids to school jacked up on okay, confession time.
Okay.
When I was in high school, yeah, confession time. When I was in high school, I would eat Pop-Tarts.
Yeah.
And I would not eat one of them, and I would not eat two of them. I would eat three of them. So, they come in packs of two, so I would do a pack and a half.
Okay.
I had a system. And not only that, but I would put butter over the top of them, and I would melt I would melt them in my little oven that my parents had. And I would go to school every day, hopped up on three. I mean, look at the sugar that's in that, Like now, I wouldn't touch them, but then, I'm a kid, whatever. We send our kids hopped up on Fruit Loops and stuff like that, and we wonder why they can't sit still. At some point, it's not. At some point, we're not helping the problem.
Right.
And I'm not saying that it can all be handled by that, but that can play a large role. And then additives. A lot of this ultra processed food, you just don't know what's in it, and we don't have trials that show, this is this is good for you or bad for you, whatever. So, decreasing processed food is really across the board, I think, a big thing. Increasing physical activity is another one too. That really kind of helps them get out some of those cake sit stills, as we call them with my middle kid. If you're asking a lot of a child to sit in the classroom all day, and so making time for some sort of physical activity. I don't know if this is good parenting or not, but sometimes when our kids just really rambunctious, we're like, go take a lap around the house.
Yeah.
And usually when they get back, they're a lot better. They just need that activity.
Yeah.
And so many times today, we're real easy to just keep kids indoors, give them a screen or whatnot. And they never really get that activity that they need to get out some of that. You could even play into anxiety. Physical activity is important. I mentioned screens. Hot topic, I know. And we go back and forth at our house. We're trying to implement some things because here's one thing that we found. And this is not backed by science. This is quasi-science Chad data. But one of the things we noticed is that the more my kids are on a screen, the worse they're behaved.
Yeah.
And the more impulsive they seem to be. All right. So one of the things we began to implement, and I think that's pretty safe to say most parents realize that. No, it's probably better and worse than some kids than others. But, the Surgeon General, U.S. Surgeon General came out in June of this year and talked about the harmful effects of social media. And I'm not even talking about social media per se, but he's talking about the fact that we know that it causes harm.
Yeah.
And in his little editorial that he wrote, he compared it to things like smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol
Hmm.
and having airbags in our cars. Like, all those things are, there's warnings on them, and those are precautions that we use because we know something is harmful.
Hmm.
And he's talking about how, social media screen time can be just as harmful for our kids for their mental health.
Hmm.
And so one of the things we started doing, and I'm not saying that this is the end all be all, but I'm just telling you some things we tried. We've tried really creating boundaries around screen time.
Hmm.
You'll hear, I heard a podcast the other day, the guy's like, no screen time is good. Like, you need to just not have any screen time. I'm like, all right, I mean, I hear you, dude, but um, we got to
It's
do
like
stuff
kind
too.
of unrealistic, especially because a lot of the learning that our kids are
Yeah,
doing is on
they're on
screens.
screens, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And I think that's where boundaries can help. So, we're not saying no to any screen time, but we've started screen time Sundays at our house. Um,
Okay.
we're a big believer in resting on the seventh day. God created us, set an example. He rested. How much more do we need to rest?
Yeah.
And too many days that just becomes another day of progress.
Hmm.
But we've really started creating some intentional time around. You know what? We're not just going to sit around on Sundays and watch TV all day.
Right.
We're going to get outside, or we're going to play board games, or and the kids showed resistance to that initially, but they've gotten where they like it.
Good.
Used to, where they'd be like, oh, I wish it wasn't Sunday. I don't want no screens. And now it's like, oh, today's no screen Sunday. And they
Okay.
just kind of have accepted it, and they really like that interaction
Hmm.
of being, hanging with mom and dad
Yeah.
and creating that space for them. Some things we do as well as creating boundaries around places in our home.
Mm.
So you can only have screens in these places,
Uh-huh.
because if they can
Yeah.
have it in their bedrooms and everywhere else, number one, that's
No.
unsupervised. Number two, that can just kind of turn into all night type deal.
Yeah, that's not happening. Yeah.
And then you think about boundaries when it comes to um, like media free time. So one of the things I'm talking about is, and I have to remind myself, is family dinner. You
Mm.
know, let's turn on do not disturb.
Yeah.
Let's put our phone. It's hard for us to demand our kids aren't on screens
If
if
we're
we're
doing,
sitting here scrolling.
yeah.
That looks inconsistent.
Have you heard of the RO box? Have you heard of that company?
Mm-hmm.
There's a company that had this same idea that decided we're going to make a very nice, elegant looking box that has chargers inside of it. And
Okay.
we're going to create an app that goes along with it and it gamifies the time that you spend off of your phone.
Oh, cool.
And so right now we have the RO box just sitting on our kitchen counter. And
Yeah.
that's a place when we get to that point where we know like this is a problem we need to like tune out from our phones,
Yeah.
or like we're going to have
Yeah.
family dinner. Let's all go put our phones in the box. So we have that
Yeah.
special place where they go and they can get to charge while they're in there and all of that.
That's cool.
And so it's a way of like delineating this is an okay space and this is not an okay space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reinforcing those boundaries. Yeah. There's I'm sure there's all sorts of things out there to help with
Yeah.
that, because there's much more awareness around that these days.
Hmm.
We're just realizing that there is technology is wonderful.
Yeah.
It connects us to all sorts of things and people and all that, but we're not made to be on screens all day.
Yeah.
Being human these days tends to look different than it did 10 years ago, and so we're trying to kind of push back against that a little bit in our house, and we found that affects behavior as well.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is sleep. We mentioned that earlier.
Oh, yes.
Realizing that hey, they need 8, 9, 10
Yeah.
hours sleep.
Mhm.
They whatever sleep they're getting, they probably need more. That seems to be our approach. Like, all right, we're going to settle on a bedtime, but we could probably do more than this, and you would be even better. But
Yeah. Yeah. And
but just really
same
reinforcing
for
that.
grown-ups too. Like in
Yep.
general, we need a lot more sleep than we're getting. And there's been a lot more research about how women need more sleep than men as
Yeah.
well. So let your wife sleep. That's my advice.
That's
Um,
right. Give her
so
a break. Let her rest. So
one thing we didn't get to talk about too much today is there is adult ADHD, and we mostly talked about kids today, and because for the most part, it is diagnosed in childhood,
usually so.
because
Yeah.
the problems come up during school.
Right.
But as we mentioned, women in particular who flew under the radar, who got through
Hmm.
school, but maybe are struggling in their careers right now. I see this a lot. They're saying, is that real? Can you be diagnosed as an adult? And you will
Yeah.
get some
100%.
pushback from some providers.
Yeah.
But basically, the way in my field in marriage and family therapy, when we need to diagnose someone basically for insurance purposes, right? Or for writing your treatment plan, we're just looking at that collection of DSM criteria.
Yep.
And if you're meeting these criteria, I feel comfortable saying like that, yeah, that's probably what that is.
Yep. 100%.
And so if you're an adult and you're meeting those criteria, there are things that you can do. All of the things that Chad and I just talked about with your diet, with exercise, with your sleep, that's going to be foundational for whatever
Yep.
mental health thing you're going through. And then there's new technology that you can use to kind of help you with your executive functioning, because that's one of the things you'll struggle with. And so definitely we don't want to see people continuing to struggle through their careers and their relationships in adulthood because
Right.
they never got diagnosed as a kid.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It was a missed opportunity. It's not that it's new onset.
Yeah, right.
And that's a different way to think about it. It's not a new onset ADHD as an adult. It's probably just something that didn't get diagnosed earlier on.
Right.
And but yeah, if you meet the criteria, and in my training, we learned it as for adults and for pediatrics. Like there's two lines of it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I have zero issue saying you can be diagnosed as an adult, and all these things can help you. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Now I know we've gone kind of long here, so I'm still like totally engaged in this conversation, and I want
same, yeah,
want to keep like talking to you about this because there's so many more nuances we could get into. But you're a friend of the podcast now, and we'll just be able to hopefully pick your brain again in the future.
sure,
But for now, tell us a little bit about what you're doing with RevRx, and
sure.
the other ministry things you're doing right now.
Yeah. One of the things I'm big into lately are daily habits. I'm, big subscriber in all the great thinkers that tell us that we are who we are because of our daily habits, right?
Okay.
One of the things I'm doing is a 40 grit challenge for men, and your husband's actually joining us
Yeah.
for this one, and so that's
Yeah,
fun
I'm
and
very
exciting.
proud. Uh-huh.
But what we're doing is we're looking at, all right, finishing the year strong for the last 40 days of 2024. Let's put some intentionality around some habits. And so there's three things we're focusing on: it's body, mind, and soul.
Mm-hmm.
And you're big on that too. But for your
Yeah.
body, exercise every day. That can look different for different people. It's flexible, but do something. For mind, I put in a gratitude prompt. Today I'm thankful for, or some of it a little more guided. But in a time of year where it's easy to look around and compare and say, oh, somebody's got this better than me, or their decorations look so much better than mine, or their family looks so much more controlled than mine, or their Christmas morning looks so much bigger. But it's tempting to look around on social media and compare ourselves, and that steals our joy,
Mm-hmm.
and that steals our satisfaction and our contentment that I think God wants us to have. And so, really, just reminding ourselves that we're blessed more than we can even imagine, and keeping our mind there for the last 40 days of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the soul aspect, I've given the men a Bible verse, and I've written a short little devotion every day. Just immersing themselves in the Word, get used to doing something soul care related.
Yeah.
And the idea is to enter 2025 in a way that is stronger and more positive than ever. And just really trying to encourage men and women too, but with this challenge, men to just really step into some of those daily habits. Make time for the things that are important to
Mm-hmm.
help you become the person you want to be.
Yeah.
And then you love to ask me, I'm going to beat you to it, my question
Okay.
for what am I doing for soul care?
Yep. You got it.
I'm doing that. So I'm doing the 40 grit challenge too. But one of the things I've loved lately, in my prayer time, like we have the things we say generally. And we don't always make it a time of listening. And we don't always make it a time of intention. And I picked up this book, and you can pick up any book of prayer. This was called Piercing Heaven,
Mm-hmm.
Prayers of the Puritans.
Oh.
I don't know if you've ever read any Puritan prayers. I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
kind of old school. You have to get rid of you have to get through some of the
Language.
language.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's so rich. And
Mm.
just hearing the prayers and the cries of some people who have gone before us, deeper and wiser than us maybe, is really, really encouraging. And that's really one of the ways where I'll pray my prayers to God, but then I'll listen through how these other people are praying. And you'd be surprised how God kind of speaks through that. But it's
Wow.
kind of one of my new foundational practices, just reading the prayers of some of the saints that have gone before us, and,
Okay.
feeling what that feels like to pray to God when, it's like reading the Psalms, really.
Mm-hmm.
When you read about all the context behind the Psalms, there are some prayers of thanksgiving. There are prayers of, man, I'm in too deep. God, you need to rescue me. There's prayers of deliverance. There's prayers of hopelessness. And, we all face that every day.
Mm-hmm.
Every day's different. And we just never know where we're going to be. So reading some of these prayers that real people have prayed in their real lives, has really been beneficial to me. So.
Wow. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to probably get that book.
Yeah,
So,
it's awesome. And the language isn't terrible. I mean, it's not
okay.
like old English or something, but,
Okay.
it's,
Nice.
it's a little old, but it's not too bad.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm really proud of what you're doing, and I'm thankful that you're doing this, the 40 Grit Challenge for men in particular. Like, as women, it's very easy for us to gather and to find ways to be together. I think
Yep.
that's a lot harder for men,
It
and
is.
to have accountability and to challenge each other and to support each other. That's really important.
Well, men like a good healthy competition too. So
There you go. Okay.
I've got guys in the group posting like pictures of themselves, and I'm like, yeah, man, this is good. You guys
Okay.
are getting a little competitive about
There
this,
you
but
go.
yeah, creating a space, realizing that you're not alone is important. Men don't like to ask for help largely,
Yeah.
and so one of the favorite things I do with my coaching is to be able to put people in a room together and somebody say, I'm struggling with this, and eyes light up and say, I thought I was the only one. Realizing, hey, your struggles are common, and together we can overcome this. So.
Well, I know that I might have more female listeners than male listeners. And so I just want to say to the ladies, like, it's okay to, nudge your husband towards this. Chad's going to run the program again in 2025. So
Yeah.
if you're too late for this one for the end of 2024, make sure you go over there to his website and get updates for when that's going to happen again. And maybe you can encourage your husband to be part of that.
That's
Or the
right.
men in your life.
Little
Yeah.
nudge. We'll do a lot of things for the women in our life.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, go to my website. If you can link it to the show notes,
Yeah, it'll be in
sign
the
up for
show
my
notes.
newsletter, and
Okay.
then you'll get all the information when it comes
Okay.
out.
And is that revrx.com?
It's the RevRx.com.
RevRx. Okay. Yeah, that'll be
Yep.
in the show notes, so you guys can click easily to there. And so, Chad, I want to let you go. It's Thanksgiving week. This is probably going to be sometime in December, but
Okay.
when people hear this, but we're getting
Sure.
ready for Thanksgiving over here. So
That's right.
I'm thankful for you. I love our conversation. So thanks for coming back
Always.
to Soul Grit.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you. Appreciate what you're doing.
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.